The 19th century was a time of great change. Industrial revolutions, wars and empires rising and falling. But behind the grand stories of progress and power, there were individuals whose actions led to suffering, destruction, and chaos. These men weren't just controversial figures. They were villains who shaped history in the worst ways possible. From ruthless rulers to legendary criminals, here are 5 of the most notorious villains from the 1800s. King Leopold II of Belgium. King Leopold II was born in 1835, the son of the Belgian King Leopold I. But his legacy wasn't about ruling Belgium. It was about what he did in Africa. He saw the vast, resource-rich lands of the Congo as an opportunity for personal wealth and power. Under the pretense of philanthropy and civilization, he took control of the Congo Free State in 1885. What followed was one of the most brutal and exploitative colonial regimes in history. Leopold's true goal was to extract as much rubber and ivory as possible from the land. To achieve this, he turned the native Congolese people into slaves, forcing them to work under horrifying conditions. If they failed to meet quotas, their hands were cut off, their families were slaughtered, and their villages burned to the ground. The infamous Force Publique, his private army, used whips, chains, and executions to maintain order. It is estimated that 10 million Congolese people died under his rule through murder, starvation, and disease. The world eventually learned about his atrocities, and international pressure forced him to surrender the Congo to the Belgian government in 1908. But by then, the damage was done. King Leopold II had filled his pockets with wealth, leaving behind a legacy of pain and suffering. He remains one of the most notorious figures in colonial history. Gregor MacGregor, the man who sold a fake country. Gregor MacGregor wasn't a conqueror or a warlord. He was something far more sinister, a con artist of legendary proportions. Born in 1786 in Scotland, MacGregor started his career as a soldier, but later turned to something far more profitable: fraud. His biggest scam? Selling land in a country that didn't exist. In the early 1820s, MacGregor convinced people that he was the ruler of Poyas, a paradise in Central America. He described it as a land full of fertile soil, gold, and opportunities. It was supposedly a haven for European settlers, promising easy riches and a fresh start. Investors poured money into the venture, and MacGregor sold fake land grants, fake currency, and even created a fake government for Poyas. The worst part? Hundreds of people believed him. Entire families left their homes, sold everything they owned, and set sail for Poyas. But when they arrived, they found nothing. No infrastructure, no civilization, just a hostile jungle. Many died from starvation, disease, and exposure. The few survivors who made it back to Britain exposed the scam, but MacGregor managed to escape serious punishment. Even after being caught, he continued running smaller cons in Europe. He eventually fled to Venezuela, where he died in 1845. Gregor MacGregor wasn't a war criminal, but his deception led to countless deaths, making him one of history's most infamous con artists. Ned Kelly, the armored outlaw in Australia. Few names are as legendary, or as controversial, as Ned Kelly. Born in 1854 to an Irish immigrant family, Kelly grew up in poverty. His early life was filled with minor crimes, including horse theft. But it wasn't long before he turned into a full-blown outlaw. Kelly's gang, known as the Kelly Gang, became infamous for robbing banks and police stations. But what set him apart from other criminals was his homemade bulletproof armor, a suit of iron that covered his body and head. This made him nearly unstoppable in gunfights. His most famous moment came in 1880 at the Siege of Glenrowan. After a string of robberies and murders, Kelly and his gang made their last stand against the police. Armed with his iron suit, he faced off against dozens of officers in a dramatic gunfight. But even the armor couldn't save him. He was shot multiple times in the legs, captured, and sentenced to death. Ned Kelly was hanged in November 1880, but his legend only grew. Some Australians see him as a folk hero, a rebel who fought against a corrupt system. Others see him as a violent criminal who terrorized innocent people. Regardless, his story remains one of the most fascinating in the history of outlaws. Jesse James, the American outlaw. Jesse James was the most famous outlaw of the American Wild West. Born in 1847 in Missouri, he grew up in a world of violence. During the Civil War, he became a Confederate guerrilla fighter, learning the skills that would later make him one of history's most feared criminals. After the war, Jesse James formed the James Younger Gang, a group of outlaws who robbed banks, trains, and stagecoaches across multiple states. He was ruthless. If anyone stood in his way, he had no problem pulling the trigger. The gang's robberies were daring, often carried out in broad daylight, and their ability to evade capture turned them into legends. But law enforcement was closing in. The gang suffered major losses, and Jesse was constantly on the run. By 1882, he was hiding under a false name in Missouri, trying to lay low. That's when one of his own men, Robert Ford, decided to betray him. Ford shot Jesse in the back of the head while he was adjusting a picture on the wall. Jesse James was dead at 34, but his legend lived on, with dime novels and Hollywood movies turning him into a Robin Hood-like figure. In reality, Jesse James was a cold-blooded killer, one of the most feared villains of the Wild West. Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico. Maximilian I of Mexico was a European aristocrat caught in the web of political ambition, imperial arrogance, and national resistance. Born in 1832 as part of the powerful Austrian Habsburg dynasty, he lived a privileged life, surrounded by wealth, art, and diplomacy. But his fate took an unexpected turn when Napoleon III of France sought to expand his influence in Latin America. In 1864, he convinced Maximilian to accept the Mexican throne, portraying it as a noble mission to civilize and stabilize a war-torn nation. Maximilian, though reluctant at first, embraced the idea of ruling Mexico, believing he could bring European ideals of governance, culture, and economic reform. His wife, Empress Carlotta, shared his enthusiasm, seeing themselves as the enlightened rulers destined to elevate Mexico. However, what they didn't realize was that Mexico did not want them. The country had already fought for its independence and was in the middle of a fierce struggle between conservatives and liberals. Benito Juarez, the leader of the Republican resistance, never accepted Maximilian as Mexico's rightful ruler. Despite being a foreign-imposed emperor, Maximilian tried to win the people's loyalty. He introduced liberal policies including land reforms, religious freedom, and worker protections, which ironically aligned more with the Republican cause than the conservative elites who had invited him. But his progressive ideas did little to sway the hearts of Mexicans, and his rule remained fragile. He made a fatal error by signing the Black Decree, which ordered the execution of any captured rebel fighters. This act of cruelty sealed his fate, making him a hated symbol of foreign oppression. By 1866, Napoleon III realized the war in Mexico was a lost cause and withdrew French military support. Maximilian, despite being urged to abdicate and flee, refused to leave his empire behind. He convinced himself that he was fighting for Mexico's future, even as his forces crumbled. By 1867, he was captured by Benito Juarez's forces in the city of Querétaro. A military court sentenced him to death for crimes against the nation. On June 19, 1867, Maximilian faced his executioners with remarkable composure. His final words were a tribute to the country he once believed he could rule. "I forgive everyone, and I ask everyone to forgive me. Viva Mexico." Moments later, bullets pierced his chest, and his reign came to an end. Maximilian's story is one of tragedy, misplaced ambition, and political miscalculation. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay updated with our latest content.